Hi guys, so this one's going to be a little bit longer because we're covering 1960s all the way to the 2000s. So we're still talking about consumer credit history. Important to know because that's how we know how we got where we are as far as consumers, right? So we talked a little bit about 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. We're in the 60s. Totally groovy. So the 1960s, everyday shopping moved from installment credit to revolving credit. However, this only happened for those who could afford a middle-class lifestyle. Those in underdeveloped urban areas continued to have limited access to credit, and that's gonna affect everybody in the 1970s. Those in urban areas only had greater access to credit when predominantly wealthy people pushed to end sex discrimination with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, also known as ECOA, in 1974. This law helped fuel the invention of credit scores, and credit bureaus rose in importance. By the 1980s, credit cards took over and most everyone can qualify. As credit access expanded, so did the role in American lives. Consumers embraced credit and used it to improve their quality of life from middle class to affluent, at least. Through the 1960s to the late 1990s, department stores, protests, and computers affected how credit went and made it an option. No, made it a necessity. So let's talk about the 1960s department store credit, suburbs, and urban unrest. It might surprise you, but the first everyday consumer credit card had little to do with banks and everything to do with department stores. Suburbs were developed with people that had cars, right, in mind. It was expected that the average suburbanite owned multiple cars by the 1960s. Shopping malls and parking lots were just springing up everywhere to make consumer experience more convenient and pleasurable with those with steady paychecks. It's so different now. I just want to pause real quick. It's so different now that shopping malls have gone in a decline, but parking lots still really popular. So anyway, in the early 1960s, if you were new to the suburb, you might receive an unsolicited charge-a-plate in the mail. And a charge-a-plate was just like a little piece of metal that had your name and your address, and it was kind of like a way that you can charge or make a charge account at a store. So competition between each store for these customers was absolutely fierce. Since consumer credit was built on long-term relationships, every single store wanted to have an upper hand, so they would send it immediately as soon as you moved in. At the time, department stores began transitioning from installment credit to revolving credit. These credit plans made revolving credit closer to what we know today. With a revolving credit plan, there were no more fixed repayment terms. Items bought would no longer be repossessed if the customers defaulted, and customers paid a percentage of the balance and interest on the unpaid balance. On this plan, they'd be in charge of when and how they wanted to repay. Bank-issued credit cards were not allowed to be used in large department stores because they like to do that charge-a-plate. Where they could be used was at small retailers and hope to compete with large department stores. So groceries, hotel places, restaurants, they also extended credit to shoppers by being part of the bank's credit network. And it won't be until the 1970s that bank-issued credit cards were used absolutely everywhere. So it was kind of like a nuanced thing. Credit and urban unrest. This is kind of interesting to me. So during the 1930s housing policies, that really changed a lot of how it affected people in urban areas versus the suburban areas. While suburban shoppers moved from installment to revolving credit, this did not happen for low-income, poor Americans, mostly living in undeveloped urban neighborhoods. They paid higher interest rates for lower quality goods that were in those suburbs. Since these Americans often had unstable incomes, revolving credit that was flexible, that would have really helped them. Yet they were stuck with inflexible installment terms and risked repossession if they missed any payments. If you were in the situation and you wanted to participate in modern living by, let's say, owning clothes or new clothes, TV, and you wanted to buy on credit, you risked repossession. Maybe you thought of going to a store in a different neighborhood, but to buy or use credit, you would need history with that retailer in particular. Otherwise, they'd need to check your credit references. And if your credit references were in a low income area, you were unlikely to get credit. These conditions pressurized and exploded in 1968 to what is now called the protests of 1968 and are often known as the turning point of the civil rights movement. And they were also a pushback against the harsh credit system for those that were in underdeveloped neighborhoods. The stores that were burned during those, because they were burning a bunch of stores, the hope was to burn all the stores during these protests that all sold on credit, and the protesters hoped that the burning of the shops would burn the records and erase their debt and allow them to start over. What they didn't know was that a lot of the records books were often kept in multiple places and off-site to be able to prevent such a thing. Equal access to credit for all wouldn't come until the 1970s. So let's talk about it. Women and the credit equality for all. Prior to the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, or ECOA, it was difficult for women to access credit. When a woman got married, her credit merged with her husband's. So let's pretend. If you're a woman, you don't have to pretend. If you're not a woman, let's pretend. Let's pretend that you're a woman and you had your own income and credit cards before marriage. Upon marriage, you would need your husband's approval to apply for and shop with credit. Since credit eligibility was determined by a loan officer and not yet by a number or anything like that, they would ask you questions from, how fertile you were. They would even offer marriage counseling if they thought that your marriage was in trouble, if you seemed a little defensive. They would list you as a dependent. You would be told that your income cannot be included in determining your household credit, even though you had your own job. And you would be told that you are in need of a cosigner, and that cosigner had to be your husband. So you'd have to ask your husband for permission to get credit for that store. And even they would deny you if you were single. So if you weren't married at all. And they say, oh, no husband, no credit. So in addition to any credit built up during the marriage, if you changed your marriage status from divorced or to widowed, you would have a gaping hole in your credit history and probably be denied credit. So women winning the battle against sex discrimination paved the way for other forms of discrimination to end when accessing credit. The ECOA not only helped more people gain access to credit, but it also helped the development of a credit score. As credit became more important in the American life, so did credit bureaus. Banks and department stores and any company that gave out credit needed to investigate the consumer to determine if they were eligible, right? So for lenders, working with credit bureaus was way cheaper and more efficient than running an in-house credit investigation team. So before they had the 3 credit bureaus, early investigations were legit an assault on your privacy. If you were part of the middle class in the 1960s and the local credit bureau wanted to send someone to see if you were eligible for credit and you just moved into the new neighborhood, they would send someone to come and talk to you. Knock, knock, knock. And the person would most likely come with a gift, and they would, talk to whoever was home and ask about what kind of work do you do? How many kids do you have? What are your religious beliefs? And they would try to check out to see how many cars you owned. Once the investigator got back to the office, they would record all the answers in the report along with an assessment of how clean your house was. Was there any furniture that you seem to have been missing? And a copy of that report would be sent to local retailers, and you can expect an unsolicited charger plate if you qualified. But imagine someone knowing this information about you, if your house was cleaned, if you did the dishes, if you had only one car, it's just, whoa. So thank goodness with ECOA, this type of investigation ended. to appear more, and I say quote unquote objective because things didn't start getting a little bit better until a little bit later, and become more neutral. Statistics and numerical models were used to determine credit eligibility a little bit later. This was timely as computing was growing popular. Okay, so we're talking about 1980s. Credit bureaus began moving consumer information from files to databanks. While this seems like a good change, using numerical models to determine credit access led to other issues, such as discrimination based on zip code. Well, we can talk about that. I think I mentioned that in another video. We'll talk about redlining and stuff like that in another video. So throughout 1970s, the credit bureaus grew in importance. Using credit scores helped these companies centralize and grow nationally. And it also allowed for individualized interest rates. At the end of the 1980s, Fair Isaac Corporation, or the FICO score, was developed and standardized all people's credit scores. So let's talk about credit being a necessity and a right. So prior to the 1960s, you need a job to get credit. By the end of the 1960s, you need credit to get a job. Expanding credit access to all during the 1970s became a moral obligation. And if you wanted to participate in the American economy, credit was a necessity, and that's a right. What did a right to credit mean, though? In part, it meant that credit was taking over. Once the stronghold of a large department store and local merchants, universal credit cards such as Visa and MasterCard rose in popularity during the 80s and 90s. No longer was it a courtesy. Americans expected retailers everywhere to offer credit. More retailers and restaurants and hotels and other industries joined the credit networks to stay competitive. In the 1980s, credit cards came to symbolize wealth and carefree spending. Prestigious cards like gold and black and platinum with higher limits were created, which allowed some to move large expenses onto cards and get deeper into debt. Affinity cards were created for specific groups, such as dentists and soldiers. Universities even offered their students credit and often received a cut of repayments. Banks assumed that students' future income would allow them to repay any debt that they racked up in interest. That worked for some, it didn't work for others. So they came up with new innovations as well, such as the home equity loans, creating new ways to borrow. By the end of the 1990s, 2/3 of American households used bank-issued revolving credit. In the 1970s, only 1/6 of the household did that. More people could borrow, and they could borrow more than ever, believe you me. By this point, the credit system had become the central organizer of the American life. Every American had a credit rating. And this rating, our credit score, affects the foundation of our lives. It affects our housing, if we could rent, if we could buy, if we can borrow to educate ourselves, if we can get food and clothes and a job qualification on credit. Credit is critical to our participation in the United States economy, and as a worker and a consumer, developing a healthy credit is a way of using credit. Being a responsible credit user means proving that you're able to borrow and repay credit. So what does that mean? In the first half of the 20th century, Americans saw that there was a rising importance of credit. By the second half of the century, credit access expanded and became a necessity for all who participated in the economy. In the 21st century, credit is still ongoing. It's still ongoing with changes due to technological advances. I mean, think about 2006, the three credit bureaus, TransUnion, Experian, and Equifax, all came together to create what we call now a Vantage score. It's a new standardized credit score. Big data, artificial intelligence, and other innovations are being developed to provide greater accuracy for credit worthiness, and that's going to affect us in the future. So these new technologies hope to help consumers have greater access and control over their credit and their identity, and the information that's out there will help them be able to use it to their advantage. But using credit to your advantage also means being able to pay that credit off and have zero utilization or low utilization to be able to be advantageous for you. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed this consumer debt history lesson from the 1960s to the 2000s. We're going to talk a little bit more about FICO scoring and vintage scoring and all of that stuff in other videos, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks, bye.